So I would like to introduce our special guest. He's going to give us some interesting information about the film and about Bing Crosby. Dr. Anton Garcia-Fernandez is a professor of Spanish at UT Martin. He and his family recently moved from Martin to Jackson, and we are so happy that they decided to move down here and make their home here in Jackson with us. He is a Bing Crosby expert, and I'll let him go into that detail. I think it's really cool that we have somebody that's a Bing Crosby expert living in Jackson. So I would just like to welcome him, welcome you, and after he gives us some information, and if you want to ask some questions, then we'll start the film. But again, we've got the refreshments in the back, so help yourself. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jenci, and thanks to everyone that had a role in putting this together here at the Jackson-Madison County Public Library. It's really a pleasure to be here in front of you. Besides teaching at UT Martin, I'm also the American co-editor of the Bing magazine, which is the magazine of the International Club Crosby. This is the Bing Crosby fan club, which began back in the 1930s and is still going strong in the United States, in England, and in other parts of the world as well. So if you're interested in knowing any more about the ICC or the International Club Crosby, which, by the way, is the longest running fan club in history, the Guinness Book of World Records has certified that, just let me know. At any point I'll be able to answer any questions you might have about that. Why are we here? We're here because of this man, Bing Crosby. And I would like to tell you that Bing Crosby was very important to me personally. I was originally born in the northwest of Spain. I've been a U.S. citizen for a while now, and I've been living in Tennessee for a long time now. But I was born in the northwest of Spain. And one of the main reasons why I'm able to speak in English with you is because of Bing Crosby. I learned a lot of English from listening to the music of Bing Crosby, from watching his movies, and I always say that he was one of my best teachers of English that I have ever had, Bing Crosby. Although I never met him, and never will, he really was, and I'm thankful for that. Everyone knows Bing Crosby as a Christmas singer. I'm sure you'd be able to name several of the songs that he is well known for. Of course, the title for this movie, White Christmas, is the biggest one of them all. But there's many more. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, for example. I'll Be Home for Christmas, beautiful ballad. Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Mele Kalikimaka with the Andrews Sisters. He recorded a lot of great Christmas songs that we remember and that have been covered by many other singers ever since. My wife, who's right there, always says that, yeah, that's Erin right there, and my daughter Libby next to her. She always says that Charles Dickens, the writer, brought the idea of Christmas into modernity by way of his stories about Christmas, like The Cricket on the Hearth and Christmas Carol, for example. And that is true. And she says also that Bing Crosby gave Christmas its voice. Bing Crosby is well known as the voice of Christmas. When I think of Christmas, when many people think of Christmas, the voice of Bing Crosby is right there in the background. So he gave Christmas its voice. But he was not just a Christmas singer. He was a multi-talented singer who could record almost any kind of music. He did pop, he did country music, he did Hawaiian music, he did religious music. But most of all, he was a very important, and a lot of people don't know this, he was very important as a jazz singer. As a jazz singer. In the 1930s, he created a new kind of singing which was known as crooning, which was a mixture of pop and jazz. And by doing that, he created and changed the face of American music forever. It was him and also the great Louis Armstrong, who were very good friends and learned off of each other. And Bing Crosby realized in those early days that he did not play an instrument but he used the microphone as if it were an instrument. His instrument was the microphone, and the way that he sang into the microphone made him not just nationally famous, but famous all over the world. There were other crooners at the time. Russ Columbo was one of them. Rudy Valley was another one. But Bing Crosby was the father of them all. He learned from a man named Al Jolson. And through the influence of the great Louis Armstrong, he was able to create this new kind of singing, this new kind of music. He became a multimedia superstar. He might have as well have been, I think he probably was, the very first multimedia superstar, because he was popular on records, he was popular on radio, he was popular in the movies, and then later on he would be popular on TV as well. When he started, he had his own TV show, and then of course his Christmas specials that he did almost every year until the end of his life in 1977. So he was a multimedia superstar. And think about this. His radio show in the 1930s and 40s, which was known as the Kraft Music Hall, that radio show in the United States alone, not all over the world, but in the United States alone, had an audience of tens of millions of people listening to him every week. So anything he sang on that show became a huge hit. And he had lots of hits throughout his career. Another thing that we don't know about Bing Crosby is that he was one of the earliest champions of African-American musicians in this country, and was one of the earliest champions of the civil rights movement before such a thing really existed, before that term had even been coined. In the 1930s, in the 1940s, Bing Crosby was making movies, was appearing on radio, was making records with some of the greatest African-American musicians of all time. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, the Mills Brothers, Louis Jordan, Ella Fitzgerald. They were all on his radio show. They made some recordings together. Louis Armstrong, for example, did a great recording with him called Gone Fishing, which was a huge hit record, and appeared on his radio show a lot of the time. Bing Crosby, there were other musicians that did this. Benny Goodman, for example. Artie Shaw. They sang and they played with African-American musicians at a time when that was just not done. And it's important to talk about this, because Bing Crosby was friends with these people. He knew what great musicians they were, and he didn't care about race. He didn't care about religion. He didn't care about the social problems that could have cost him, because they were his friends, and he wanted to play and record with the best. And this is one of the things that is hardly ever acknowledged. We talk about other people who were important, but Bing Crosby sometimes is forgotten, and he was there among the very first to pay attention to this. As an actor, he was also very well known. He even got an Oscar. He was awarded an Oscar for a movie called Going My Way. Really good movie, too, that some of you might remember. Also, he made some really interesting movies with Bob Hope and Dorothy Lamour. Bob Hope was a good friend of Bing Crosby, and they loved being together, spending time together, and made some movies together. The Road to movies, Road to Morocco, Road to Rio, Road to Utopia, you know, different movies that were completely, well, not completely, but almost completely ad-libbed. There was a very thin script, and they basically just ad-libbed because that's what they did in real life. They were not necessarily acting in those movies, and that's why those movies are so fresh even today in many cases. Bing Crosby was also important as a businessman. He funded the invention of magnetic tape at a time when it did not exist, right after World War II. And why did he do that? Well, because he wanted good sound for his records, good sound for his radio shows, but also because this allowed him to pre-record his radio shows, and that way he would have more time to play golf, which was one of his biggest passions. Now, he advanced the sport of golf quite a bit, because at that time, in the 30s and 40s, it wasn't as popular a sport as it would become later. and Bing Crosby was an important part of the development of golf as a popular sport in this country. Another thing he did as a businessman was that he was one of the first investors in Minute Maid orange juice. So every time I drink Minute Maid orange juice, which I make a point of doing, of course, I think of Bing, because he was one of the very first to do that. And also, I have family in Pittsburgh, and he was part owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates for several years. He was not from Pittsburgh. I don't know why he was part owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates. He loved baseball. He wasn't very good at calling baseball on the radio. There's a recording on YouTube, I think, somewhere, of him calling a few, like maybe an inning or two, and he doesn't do a good job with that. But he loved baseball. He played baseball growing up, and he was part owner of the Pirates for several years. He was, very importantly, a big influence on many other singers that came later. People like Frank Sinatra, like Perry Como, like Dean Martin, even Elvis Presley, you know, about an hour away from here at 706 Union Avenue in Sun Records in Memphis. In 1954, when Elvis was just very young, Elvis recorded a song called Harbor Lights, a Hawaiian-type ballad. That was originally a Bing Crosby song, and Elvis was singing it. Even the Beatles, you know, when the Beatles recorded Please Please Me, John Lennon says that he wrote Please Please Me after listening to a song that Bing Crosby recorded in the 1930s called Please. Oh, please, bring a little ear to my plea, you know. And the idea was please and please used in different ways gave him the idea for Please Please Me. Bing Crosby there again. George Harrison was a big fan of Bing Crosby music. He used to play Bing Crosby records and then strum along on the ukulele, apparently, to some of them. Also important was Bing's role in World War II. He did a lot for the war effort in those days. And this book right here, which just came out, this is my copy of it, is called The War Years, 1940-1946 by Gary Giddens, one of the most important jazz critics of all time. He just wrote this book. It's about 700 pages, only about the years of World War II. So he was very important in boosting the morale of the troops. He made a lot of records to help the war effort. He sang overseas. He did a lot of USO tours with Bob Hope and other people. So if you want to know how important Bing Crosby was during World War II, this is the book to get. It just came out, hot off the presses, by Gary Giddens.
I made a note for us to order it, so.
And the first part of this book is already in the library, which tells you about the time before World War II, since 1903 when he was born until 1940. It's called A Pocket Full of Dreams. A very good book to understand how Bing Crosby became the huge star that I'm telling you that he was. Let me tell you briefly about the movie before we play it. This movie is called White Christmas. It's from 1954. It was directed by Michael Curtiz. And Michael Curtiz is a director that's very important because of, not necessarily just because of this movie, but because he made some other really good movies starting in the 40s, in the 30s actually. Movies like Yankee Doodle Dandy, good musical with Jimmy Cagney. Casablanca, most of all. You probably know that movie with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. That's him. Michael Curtiz was the director of this movie. Angels with Dirty Faces, that's a good noir movie. And even Elvis comes again, the movie King Creole. One of the most famous Elvis movies was directed by Michael Curtiz. The songs, White Christmas and all the other songs, are written by a man called Irving Berlin. Now, some of you may not remember who he is. He was not even an American. He was a Russian-born immigrant into this country. But he wrote a song that we all know, and as Americans love, God Bless America. Now, he was not American, but he wrote that song, Irving Berlin. And many, many others, the ones in here, and several others, several for movies starring Fred Astaire. The song White Christmas was not even written for this movie originally. It was written for a 1942 movie called Holiday Inn, starring Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire. And sometimes I wondered, when I was younger, I would think, why does he say, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas? Isn't Christmas white usually in the northern hemisphere, right? So the reason why he did that was that in those days, when Irving Berlin wrote this song in the 40s, there was such a thing as the verse, which was an introduction that led to the chorus, which is what we know. And if you look at the verse, which most singers did not sing, the verse tells you about the singer being somewhere in LA, and it's sunny on Christmas. And so he dreams of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, for that reason. That's how we can explain that. The plot, of course, is very simple. The important thing is the music. And the plot is also related to World War II. I've already talked about how important Bing Crosby was in World War II. And this movie somehow draws some of its inspiration from World War II, which had been over by just maybe, 8 or 9 years by the time this movie was made in 1954. Let me tell you finally about the other people that star with Bing Crosby in this movie. Bing is right here. And next to him, we find Rosemary Clooney, the aunt of George Clooney, of course, but that's not her main claim to fame because she was big friends with Bing Crosby. They helped each other along the way throughout their lives. But she was an outstanding jazz and pop singer. Started in the late 40s and going on all the way until the 80s. In the 70s, she made some really good jazz records. But if you want to know how good of a singer she was, think of two things. First of all, a song that appears towards the end of this movie called Love, You Didn't Do Right By Me, which is a torch song that she sings beautifully with a lot of soul. And there's an album that she did with Duke Ellington in the 1950s called Blue Rose. And that's another thing that you should think about when you think of Rosemary Clooney. That's a great album to listen to. Then we have Danny Kaye. Now, Danny Kaye was a multi-talented artist, a great sidekick for Bing Crosby, up to the level of Bob Hope in many cases. He was very talented as a singer, as an actor, as a comedian, as a dancer, as you will see here. And he made the original version of the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which was redone later. You may remember the new version. Now, the original version was a movie starring the great Danny Kaye. And finally, next to them, Vera Ellen. Vera Ellen, somewhat forgotten these days. You will see that she's not, maybe is not very well known these days, but if you watch this movie closely, you'll see how talented she was as a singer, but mostly as a dancer. She was a fantastic dancer, and, well, sometimes the others have a hard time keeping up with her, particularly Bing, but she really is a great asset to this movie. All right, enough of me. The important thing now is to pay attention to this movie, directed by Michael Curtiz, with Bing Crosby, Rosemary Clooney, Danny Kaye, and Vera Ellen from 1954, White Christmas. And happy holidays, everyone. Thank you for being here.